Здравствуйте. So I'm not doing the talk in Russian. I'm sorry, my Russian's not that good. So a little bit about me. I do work with the Python Software Foundation in the US. I sit on the board. I do a lot of work with PyLadies. I have an open source library called MESA, which is agent-based modeling. And I run a group called Women Data Science DC, which just hit over 1,000 members in Washington, DC. So, после 4 лет в университете я говорю по-русски чуть-чуть. На Python.ru я узила новые слова after party. Мой профессор будет так гордо. So, let's get started. Jared Spool is a well-known for his work in user-centered design. And he posted this tweet in May of this year. At the end of the day, it isn't the logo that makes or breaks the product or company. It's the experience that the company delivers. It's important to note the last line, it's the experience. So today we're going to take user-centered design techniques and apply them to software. Now, how many times have you looked at a library or tried to use a library or someone else's code and ended up feeling like this? You just get frustrated, the documentation's bad, the way they lay out their API is not intuitive, and you know this is the thing that you want to use. Somebody put a lot of time into this, but you can't use it. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, how to make your code more usable for others by using user-centered design. So what is user-centered design? Normally, it's applied through the front end of a website. If you go to this website, it is a website of the US government that does power, I think fuel extractives industry. And in this picture is when the team was using user-centered design techniques in order to create a website that people would actually use. When you look at this website, that was, I believe, the second version of the website that they created, but they had minimal budget and minimal time, and what they ended up doing was creating a beautiful user interface. And so this is what I'm proposing to do with code. I'm sure you're familiar with URLib 2, raise your hand, yes? Doesn't matter if you can't read it, I'll tell you what it says. This is the basic code to open up a URL in URLib 2. And familiar with requests? Yes? Okay. This is requests. For those of you who are familiar with these, you don't need to know what it says. You just need to know that this number of lines turned into this number of lines. That is a good user experience. So the point is that creating a good user experience leads to people using your library. Now more people use requests for the majority of their projects than URLib 2. And on top of that, it should be noted that with the first example in URLib 2, requests would not exist without URLib 2 existing. One had to come before the other. So this is sort of like an iteration within our culture of Python. So in this talk, I labeled the title open source. So why am I saying open source? Because that's the culture that Python is about, but some of these techniques can also be applied to inner source. For those of you who are not familiar with inner source, it's where you have a open source within a company. So if you have a large set of developers and you're sharing code within a company, that's the term of inner sourcing. And then closed source, where it's not open at all. Most of my examples, though, and everything center around open source. So while we're going through this today, I want you to pick a project and think about how you might apply some of these techniques. So, user-centered approaches, this is divided into two sections. The first one is passive, which is a way of creating a signal in noise, meaning you do this one thing, it is a sort of set recipe, and you don't, you create a welcoming environment. And the other one is active, where you have direct engagement, and that's where some of the more fun exercises come in. So as we must, let's take our vitamins first. Signal versus noise. This is a list of 89 agent-based software modeling libraries. Now I'm using the agent-based modeling software example because that's what I'm building a library for in Python. Not all of these are open source, but when you have such an environment, it makes me question, agent-based modeling is not something a lot of people do. Why does the world have 89 software packages that do it? It's because a lot of people did not talk to their users to figure out why the first 88 did not work. I hope there isn't 91 with the one I'm creating. I hope mine's 90 and then it ends. So this is a continual problem. There's often these libraries that people just continue to create. If you look at the Python ones for Twitter, it's another problem. If you look at the ones for GitHub, and these are libraries to access the APIs, it's another problem. And this one doesn't even have descriptions. These are not made for users to easily understand. So a good example actually came out of one of my former employer. And it's very simple. My former employer is 18F. It is a digital consultancy inside the US government to help build capacity inside the US government. And the example I'm about to present is called the FEC API, and FEC stands for the Federal Election Commission. In the US, this provides data for federal elections based on campaign contributions, so who gave what money to whom and which political candidate. And they make it very easy to use their API and to discover how to enter it and to get involved with it by basic things like a landing page, getting started, documenting their communication channels, and providing clear documentation. You can find these all online. So when I started to think about this, at the same time, I was reading this book. It's called The Checklist Manifesto. It's a good book, but it might be boring for some. But it's basically a book about how checklists help improve success and repeatability. And so then I thought, well, what kind of checklist can we have for software developers? And in the book's examples, they're a little bit more high stakes. For example, airline pilots and their checklists, and surgeons and their checklists, to wash your hands before you do surgery, check. To introduce yourself to your teammates, check, because that will actually lead to better outcomes in surgery. And so I thought, well, what is a checklist for creating a good passive user experience? This is the one I came up with. It might not be where your user is your software developer who's using your library or software. It might not be complete, so if there's something missing, please let me know. But some sort of landing page, that could be your GitHub page, or some sort of like a document landing page, some sort of getting started to show an example that people can work off because people learn in different ways. Install instructions, even if it's as small as pip install X. A contribution guide so people know how to play by your rules. Is it very formal? Is there a review process or not? Responses in less than 24 hours is quite important. There was a research done, I believe, on Mozilla's repos, and they found they had the highest response and engagement with users when they responded within 24 hours. Now, when you run a open source library, and that open source library is, like the one I run, is mainly with one other person. We've had 22 contributors, but it's mostly just me and this one other person. Sometimes 24 hours, every 24 hours within 24 hours doesn't exist, but we try our best to respond within 24 hours to keep people engaged and excited and not to be the ones holding up the process. Clear, and these sort of are in kind of a complexity order, but clear GitHub workflow, that goes along with contributing, labeled branches, license. If there's no license, you've lost a bunch of users right there. Project communications, so people know where to ask questions, unless there's a point where the project gets so big that they can go anywhere on the internet to ask questions, like Stack Overflow. But when a project is small, it's important for people to access the project maintainers directly, like a list on Google or some other email list or Slack. Project status. What's coming up in the next release, what's in master, what's being planned, what are you thinking, so people understand this. Project ownership, again, to work with the communications. Regular commits, because it says you're actually a live project. And test and build results, so people understand the stability of the project. Other users basically means who else is using the project, who is like a company or another project to basically act as an indirect endorsement of your project. Like so-and-so uses our project. You see this on websites all the time with products. And that is a way to get people to believe in your project. And then open default, and that's more like, I'll say, directly applied to open source projects and not inner source too, but not closed source. So open by default, it's another concept that comes from 18F. And it's not 18F's idea, but it's the idea that, there's an article about it, the idea that you put your code out there when you start a repo with nothing in it, and you put it out there as early as possible, as ugly as it is, even like if it's just an idea on a piece of paper, in order to start communicating with people that you're doing a thing and that thing is something you're working on. So if they are looking for something and getting excited and want to do the same thing, that both of you aren't doing it at the same time, but that you end up collaborating on it. So also flexible usage, community involvement, cost savings, and because it's out there and exposed, increased security. So let's go back to that list on GitHub. Now for 1 second, some of these libraries do different things. I actually looked all of them up. But for 1 second, some of them are quite similar. Let's assume they all do the same thing. And one that particularly stuck out was GitHub 3. It had a lot of the components of what I had mentioned, but also, it's hard to see, these are all the commit maps from GitHub from all those projects, and GitHub 3 stands out as one that also has this regular build cycle, although you can't really tell from that list. So communicate, commit, test, and build regularly. Or, for your users, consciously commit to killing your project or labeling it that you've walked away, not killing it necessarily, but that you've walked away and you need another maintainer, but set that expectation. There was a library I came across the other day that I really wanted to use, and it was in Python, and there were like 6 pull requests waiting for like the last year or two, and everyone, like this was the library and everyone had hope, but I didn't want to invest my time in it knowing that they weren't making any progress forward. And sad to say, I actually used the Java version of the same application to be able to fix the issue that I needed to fix. Okay, part 2. Let's engage users. Why do we engage users? Because when you engage users with, which means like going to talk to them and other things, you have the ability to collect direct data, which is a way to justify the direction you're headed with your project. So in these examples, I'm going to illustrate with the project I run, which is the modeling project, which has a back-end code base API, and then it also has this really ugly front end. If anyone wants to help, I could use help. So the first technique is called inception or reinception. It is a technique that is that came out of a company in the US called Pivotal Labs. And it's the idea of sort of generating, classifying the ecosystem of a project, and starting with identifying its stakeholders and its users. So just to clarify, stakeholders are people who have a stake in the project, let's say companies using your software, financial investments, they don't really use it, they just have a stake in it. And then users are the ones who are actually using it, the other software developers. And then goals and non-goals. So in this exercise, you create these 4 categories, and then you make a list of each of these with your team or your group, and so you identify goals being what are short-term goals, what are long-term goals, and non-goals are just as important to identify because those help you figure out what you're not working on. So let's focus on users. So in this example, we have users, we have a software engineer, college professor, a student, private industry researcher, and data scientist. All these users come from a different background, a different set of skills. They're all going to approach the library in a different way. So for each of these users, you want to think about creating a persona. For example, the college professor might have some experience in Visual Basic or something, so that's the direction that they're coming from. A student might be trained in Java, private industry, who knows? And data scientists would be like, knows really well R and Python, and a software engineer, though, knows the full stack going down. So let's focus a little bit on college professor. So like I said, he might have some experience programming, maybe not. You know, he or she may like their old tools that they're used to. They might have limitations in their work environment, for example, which computers or how much resources they have access to. And so these are the things you want to consider when building for that particular person. Now, how do you find these people to do some of these exercises with? And we'll get back to the exercise in a second. So these are the ways that I've found people. User groups, open callouts. Open callouts are like on Twitter, or an open call out to a user group, conferences, direct emails if you know people or look people up on LinkedIn, and sprints. I cannot emphasize sprints enough. Most of the progress on the project that I've been working on has been done during PyCon and SciPy sprints, staying late after the conference, and that's where I got most of the 22 people to engage and contribute to the project. When you do one of these call-outs, you can also do an easy way to figure out who wants to actually participate is to send out a survey, ask a few basic questions. If you ask too many, people won't respond. And then put a question that says, may we reach out to you? And somebody who wants to participate more will do so. So one of the important things and first things you should do is user research. And some of these ideas are very basic, but they are it's important to consider each one. So, in a user interview, you talk to your users, know what you want to capture, pre-plan, what is your goal? So are you looking to capture more about how that person uses it, more about how your documentation works or doesn't work, more about how people discover your API, what are you looking for? And then write a script for this and focus on that script, which is get your questions ready. So designated note taker, assuming you have a luxury, when you're talking to someone, you can't also take notes and be engaged in the conversation at the same time because you'll miss out on body language, which I think is later in the list. And that way the person who's actually engaged in the interview is the one sort of mentally taking notes on the body language. Is this person telling me everything they should be, or are they holding back? And the person who's taking the notes can then focus on documenting those notes while the interviewer is eliciting the responses. Use electronic tools so you can share things. Verbatim and interpretations are separate, meaning verbatim is like quotes. Interpretations are summaries to say something that somebody says exactly is just as important as a summary of what they said. So try to capture both. Annotate along the way as you start to see themes. Don't forget body language. And most important, consider privacy from the start, because sometimes during these interviews, people will say things that are not people will say things that are very honest sometimes and possibly can be offensive, and if that material gets out, you don't want them to get in trouble for it for some reason. So the next exercise is one of my favorite, journey mapping. So basically, sometimes this is also called a walkthrough. You basically sit down with the user side by side, and they walk through the usage of your product, in this case, your software library. And you basically draw a squiggly line that explains their experience. And so in the case of one that I had done with a user, they got really excited when they identified my library, and then they tried to build a model and they were not so happy because it was confusing and difficult. And then they built a model, so then they got happy again. But then they tried to build a custom complex model and they really were not happy. But then they contributed back to Mesa to fix some issues and they became a little bit happy again. Now, the important part about this is not so much about this journey, but are the dips in the journey and where it slides downward. That's where you should focus some of your resources on the things you need to fix. So in this particular case, it was when the interviewee was trying to build a model and then trying to build the model again. And then I think this is the last one, affinity diagramming. Well, this is kind of affinity diagramming and dot loading. So affinity diagram is a way to find a collection of ideas, observations, and bring those together. So you have a bunch of users, and this is where you have, so the ones before this were individual users, and the ones after this is more of a group exercise. And in this particular example, you have a bunch of users, and you have note cards or Post-it notes or something, and they write down all the things they want to, or the things they're confused about, or the things they have questions about with respect to your software package. And then together you group those into buckets. So here's everything on the left is everything having to do with tutorials, getting started, so on and so forth. Top right is just about testing, and then the bottom is about how to contribute, unclear on how to build plugins, and when does something go into core versus a private library. So let's talk about dot voting. So we have some ideas. We know we have some problems on the tutorials. We know we have some problems on the contributing, and then we have that one up there about testing. So then everyone is given some number of dots. A good way to start is 3, depending on how many of these things you have, and you can have hundreds like that initial image. You might need to give people more voting rights. So each dot is a vote, and all the users can then vote on which one they think is the most important thing and the software developers, and vote on the most important thing to work on next. So here I have 3 users, they all vote once, then they vote again, and then they vote a 3rd time. Now, interestingly, you can see that there's this cluster, and there's a lot of bugs in the tutorial, and maybe that's why getting started is hard, and so maybe that's just one problem, and so maybe that's like a sprint in itself. But more importantly, there was this one note out here by itself that one person said, this is a huge problem, it needs to be addressed, and then everyone else said, oh yeah, I didn't think about that, but I want to put my support behind that. We need to write more tests for our models. So then from this, you can do an exercise called rapid prototyping. If you want to do this all in one day, you could do this in one day. It's going to be a long day. But this exercise is basically 3 prototypes in 3 hours. Create a prototype in 40 minutes, test a prototype in 15, take a break, repeat 3 times. So on the front end, a prototype might look like this. Draw boxes and some lines and some buttons. And then testing would mean taking it to a user and saying, okay, how does this work for you? How do you interact with this? What is this doing? What is this not doing for you? Well, rapid prototyping for code might just be writing simple code or pseudocode. Pseudocode meaning like fake code. And going to a user then and saying, if this is how we set up, and this is an example where you're creating a library from scratch, not dealing with one pre-existing, but it's the same idea. But if we were to set up something in this way, how would that work for you? How would that not work for you? How do you, if you were trying to build a model, how would you use these classes? And then test and repeat. Now, one of the most important things is, if you do not have users, you are doing it wrong. This is not for you to sit by yourself and try to do these exercises and pretend like you are users. If you are building something for yourself, then you might as well just keep it private, because it's not helping other people, it's helping you. And so some of these methods, there are more methods, but those are just some of the examples that I've used, but there are more exercises, and you can find detailed descriptions at this link. And so the purpose of this is to take code that looks like this and turn it into this. And lastly, the gentleman who created the request library posted this tweet in the last month or 2, and it was perfect timing for me and this talk. P.S. Your API is a user interface. Thank you.
Вопросы? Руки? Anyone? Nope. No questions then. Thank you.